Welcome to the Defence Forces podcast, brought to you by the Defence Forces Public Relations Branch.
Hello and welcome to the Irish Defence Forces podcast. My name is Captain Cian Clancy, and on today's special episode we're speaking to Colonel Retired George Kerton and Colonel Retired Richard Heaslip about Irish involvement in Congo in late August into September 1961. With regard to Congo, a lot of our listeners will be familiar with the action at Jadotville. However, today's episode is going to focus specifically on actions associated with Elizabethville and on the story of Trooper Patrick Mullins. Welcome on to the show, sirs. Thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you.
I suppose it's important to stress at the outset as well that we're looking at it today from a specifically academic perspective, and while neither of our guests today actually served as part of the mission in the Congo at the time, you spent a lot of your serving with Congo veterans and have spent a lot of time studying the actions from an academic perspective. So I suppose to start off the episode, I think a question for yourself, Colonel Kerton, sir. Could you give us an outline of the background to the situation in Congo in 1961 and maybe an outline of the importance of Katanga province?
I suppose the Congo became independent at the end of June of 1960, and it probably was the most unprepared country in the history of mankind for decolonisation. And the UN plan was for two missions, a civilian mission and a military mission. And the function of the civilian mission was to take over and run the Congo, because none of the Congolese were prepared. Political activity was only allowed midway through 1957. The structure of the political parties and organisations was based on a tribal basis. So the UN went in there with an idea to run the country, and every agency of the United Nations was involved, right through from air traffic control to health to education to transport to banking to the economy, basically. And the purpose of the military mission was to have lightly armed troops to maintain a safe and secure environment, maintaining law and order. In the words that were used at UN headquarters and in Dáil Éireann when we're debating the deployment of the troops, was operations of a policing nature. So very soon, as I say, at the end of June, independence kicked in, and 11 days later, Moshé Tshombe, the leader of Katanga, he declared independence, and that caused a huge problem for central government, caused a huge problem for UN. Now, just to describe the province of Katanga, it's about the size, marginally smaller than Spain, population of 1.6 million Africans and about 44,000, mainly European, but non-Africans. It was a problem, and from the word go, Tshombe refused entry to the UN. It wasn't going to allow them to deploy troops. And that took the Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld to go to the Congo and negotiate with Tshombe. And by the 12th of August 1960, he was allowed lead in just 2 companies of Swedish troops into Elizabethville. Thereafter, then, the UN deployed to Kamina Base, and they deployed to the northeast of the province, centred around Albertville. The province of Katanga was the wealthiest province in the Congo. Huge deposits of minerals, at everything from gold to silver, uranium, cadmium, in particular copper. And the mining company was known as Union Mineria du Haut Congo, UNMK. And they were a multinational corporation with American, Belgian, British and French interests. And they were bankrolling Tshombe and his breakaway regime. Tshombe had not just financial backing, but he had political backing of Belgium in particular. And that mining company has been described as being a state within a state. And he bankrolled the whole breakaway state. He paid for the mercenaries. They paid for the mercenaries. And in 1961, in excess of $37 billion was paid, not into the central Congolese government exchequer, but to the breakaway state of Katanga, and that was part of the problem. By 1961, the UN had deployed, and the Katanga command was divided into 3 sectors. Sector A was headquartered in Albertville, up on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, and had a number of posts like Niemba that were well known to us. They also were down in Minono. And in that area, they had, from the time of the 33rd Battalion, they had negotiated a sort of an area of what they called a neutral zone, an area of separation between the incoming National Congolese Army, the ANC, the Gendarmerie, and the third party to that conflict was the Bluba tribe. Sector B was based in Elizabethville, and in 1961 they were just based in Elizabeth and nowhere else. They would have had something just less than 2,000 combat troops. Sector C was at Camina Base. This was a vast military base built by the Belgians, stretching over about 100 square miles. And at that time, they had about 440 odd combat troops. 333 of those were Irish of the 1st Infantry Group. So that was the phase set in. The first Irish troops to deploy to Sector B into Elizabethville were the 34th Infantry Group. They came in January of 1961, and they handed over to the 35th Battalion in around May, June of 1961. And they were there, and you had still the two companies of Swedes. You had the 34th Battalion redeployed from Camina Base into Elizabethville piecemeal. Later on, they were joined by two Indian battalions from the Indian contingent, the Dogra and the Gurkha battalions. Their role of the 34th Battalion that was inherited by the 35th Battalion was basically looking after the airport. The airport was the main lifeline to get into Katanga province, in through Elizabethville, and that was the importance. Elizabethville was the epicentre of everything that happened in the province of Katanga.
Right, sir. And just from the perspective of sort of the secession of Katanga from a UN perspective, was the kind of goal of the UN being here, was it to reunite Congo and Katanga, or to calm tensions, or just abroad? What was the end goal that was hoped to achieve?
I suppose after independence, with the breakaway of Katanga, and that was part of the problem. But throughout Katanga, there was the whole country just descended into chaos. Politically, I said they were unprepared. Kasavuvo, the president, sacked Lumumba, who was the prime minister. Lumumba sacked Kasavuvo. Then the chief of staff was a man called Mobutu. He then declared a coup. So you had four entities. You had the presidency, you had the prime minister, you had the chief of staff, and parliament, each making demands on the UN. It was absolute total chaos at this stage. So the problems for the UN came about on the 24th of February 1961, in that one of a succession of UN security resolutions moved the mandate from UN from maintaining a safe and secure environment to allow the UN civilians to carry out their civilian mandate, but to maintaining the territorial integrity of the whole of the Congo. So basically, UN got suckered in from being a peacekeeping into war fighting because of that particular resolution. And remember, this was the second ever UN armed mission. Before that, in 1956, we had the United Nations Emergency Force that came into the Sinai. That was a small-scale operation with the agreement, obviously, after the Suez crisis, when the British, the French and the Israelis invaded Egypt in the Sinai Peninsula. UNEF, what became UNEF-1, was set up. Mm-hmm. And that was the only previous experience the UN had of peacekeeping. UN, every world leader, everybody was unprepared for what happened in the Congo. And particularly the Congo. The problem with the Congo then was Dag Hammarskjöld was in his second tour of duty, if you like, as the UN Secretary General, and he wanted to leave his legacy. He wanted to sort the Congo. And UN New York was remotely controlling what was happening on the ground. They were telling people on the ground what was really happening on the ground. Yeah. That was part of the problem.
It sounds like an extremely complex situation, sir. From your perspective, Colonel Heaslip, sir, just the significant events that were occurring for the 35th Infantry Battalion at this time as they took over, as we discussed, in the 34th, and having Elizabethville as a centre point. Can you kind of give us an outline of those significant events?
Before we go to that, everybody was on a steep learning curve, and so were the troops. And the 35th Battalion were no strangers to that concept either. They were learning as they go. They had replaced the 34th Battalion in Elizabethville and continued what was effectively a brigade level operation in the city, which, as George indicated, was an epicenter strategically, militarily, politically, as to what was happening in Katanga. 35th Battalion came in, did what battalions do, secured itself, prepared its defensive positions in its camp, etc. And it undertook a range of patrols and the urban and rural patrols to familiarise themselves with the operational area. And they came in July, and they had they were easing into their operations and becoming familiar with their the area of likely deployment in the city. There are 4 battalions, again emphasising there are 4 battalions in the city, and controlled by Katanga Command through Sector B HQ. But the personality of the military in Elizabethville is kind of a bit dominated by the Indian Brigade Commander Raja, and that headquarters were drafting the plans, the operational plans for the force at its disposal across the province. And of course the headquarters of Sector B were adjusting that for the area, its area of responsibility, namely the city of Elizabethville and its environs. And these tasks then were given as missions to the particular battalion to be part of the overall concept of operations that were happening in the city. And there are 3 sort of 3 operations which are worthy of mention in respect of the demands they made on the 35th Battalion. The first one was there was a patrol to an area called Dilolo. It was about round trip from Elizabethville. It was about 1,600 kilometres, and over a varying road network. But this patrol went out scheduled to go out for 7 days, starting on the 23rd of August, to rescue missionary family that was in Dilolo. They were successful in that operation, and in the course of the operation, they lost one armoured car through going off the road, and it was a rather hectic patrol. 17 vehicles in it, full spectrum of resources such as comms and engineers and that, but and A Company provided a platoon in that patrol, and the cavalry provided a number of armoured cars for the operation to secure the patrol. They went over very rough routes along the way, and as I say, one of the cars was lost and had to be abandoned, stripped and left there. And what people will remember of this patrol was that it was successful, but the heat, the travel fatigue, together with the restricted food, water, etc., all combined to make it a grueling patrol, and it's in that way it's remembered by the participants. Yeah. Now they just come back to base when the next major operation is being planned, and this one was significant, and that was Operation Rumpunch, which was scheduled for the 28th of August. The Dilolo Patrol had been called back early to allow for the fact that resources were limited, and Rum Punch was being organised. And that kicked off on the 28th of August, and the objective was focused on the mercenaries. They were to seek to find them, arrest them, and then, detain them was the word used, and then they were to be expelled from the province. And that was done. And in that operation, all the companies of the 35th Battalion were involved, usually with support also from the armoured car group.
And I suppose, sir, just these were the mercenaries employed by the Katanganese government as a de facto, yes, as an army for them.
Yes, the mercenaries really start hitting the headlines in the Congo, but they were providing training and expertise, and really were the backbone of the gendarmerie forces.
If we just come in there, the term mercenaries is used in all of our unit histories. There's all of the UN reports, but there are different categories of mercenaries, and that there were quite a number of these. You're talking about a figure about 500, 550, and I think probably maybe 1/3 of those were actually Belgian seconded officers and senior NCOs, warrant officers, the rank of adjutant, but they were seconded by Belgium to support the gendarmerie at this stage. They were paid for and pensioned by the government.
Oh,
They weren't soldiers for hire.
Yeah.
So that distinction has to be made. It's very important. I mentioned early on about political and financial support. That's part of it.
Yeah.
That was part of the problem.
Yes. They were detained. The Irish battalion detained 41 in that operation, and then they went into the process of being expelled from the province. There was no control of them once they'd left. They made their way back and took their place back in their units, as would be proved subsequently during other operations. But this operation, Rum Punch, was considered very successful by all in the military and all the participants in it. There was no great opposition to them as they performed their detention of the particular individuals, and effectively then they detained them and gone out, and now they sat back, and I believe they were the UN was overconfident as a consequence of this particular operation. It had run very smoothly and there had been no casualties. That then, based on that, the next phase of operation, almost a part 2, was to be Operation Morthor, which ran from the 13th of September to the 20th of September, as events would prove. And the objective of this operation, a bit like the first operation, there was elements of Rum Punch in what this operation was going to do, except that this was focused on arresting and detaining named VIPs of Chombe's cabinet, and also on securing particular locations that were useful for propaganda purposes by the Katangese authorities. These were to be occupied. So the focus was on arresting particular political VIPs, and particular situations or particular installations. The Radio Katanga and the post office were important communication installations that they were focusing on. And in effect, Operation Morthor, viewed in present terms, would be seen as being a brigade-level operation, fighting in a built-up area, FIBOA operation, that nobody was prepared for. The operational environment of Elizabethville, you got to consider it. It was relatively modern city with the mix of shantytown and very European level buildings, and it was laid out on a north-south axis, geometric sort of pattern, but central to it all was a railway line that effectively ran north-south through the city, and it divided it into east and west. It made communication from the east side of the city to the west side of the city very important, and it put a particular focus on an area that comes important in this, is the tunnel that was an area that was going to feature in Operation Morthor, and would subsequently, at a later battalion, later in December of the year, would again feature as a major critical point. The operation order for the Operation Morthor was given out at an O group, and the 35th Battalion, effectively their mission would be that at 0400 hours on the 13th of September, the 35th Battalion was to seize, hold and control specified locations and detain named Katangan VIPs. Each of the infantry companies of the battalion, preceding this, a company had been dispatched to Jadaville, so the battalion had only 2 rifle companies for its operation. And each of the companies was assigned an armoured car group, an armoured car section to assist them in their operations. The other elements of the armoured car group, 3 armoured cars were sent to the under command, the Indian battalions, and they were involved in very heavy fighting subsequently. On the day, the operation was quite successful, except in that it took the locations it was required to take. But none of the VIPs were captured. They had advanced knowledge of what was happening, and they disappeared. So effectively, you end up at 0400 hours that the operation kicked off, quite successful in taking particular locations. And the people who were with the Indian battalion were in the heaviest fighting. So we just take it from there.
And just as you're talking about Operation Morthor, and before we kind of get into the meat of exactly kind of what happened, how does Operation Morthor, because you mentioned, Colonel Heaslip, that there was similar objectives between Operation Morthor and Operation Rumpunch. Can you outline the kind of main differences between say Rumpunch and Morthor in that sense?
You take that, George?
I will certainly, yeah. For Operation Rumpunch, the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel McNamee, had all of his assets. He had his 10 armoured cars for that particular operation, and in addition, he had 1 company from the Indian Dogra battalion. Now, for Morthor, the gendarmeries were forewarned. All the politicians were forewarned. They had inside intelligence. Now, where that came from is debatable. It might have come from the UN Civi side. They were trying to encourage, to bully Chombe to get rid of his mercenaries. That was the objective at this stage. Now, something might have been let slip, but what had happened after Rumpunch is all of the mercenaries ceased to wear uniforms, just parade around in uniform. Prior to that, but they stopped. They were able to. They knew from what happened at Rumpunch what the objectives would have been. All the vital installations, the radio college, the radio Katanga, the post office at this stage. And what they had done is they'd stashed weapons in the vicinity of those, and they had mercenaries that could blend into the population, move around freely around the city, and be there when Hajor happened at this stage. From the point of view of the battalion commander for Operation Morthor, he had his A company detached. They were gone to Jadaville, plus 2 of his armoured cars from the armoured car group. 2 of his armoured cars were put under command to the Swedes, and 3, as Dick said, were under command to the 2 Indian battalions at this stage. Mm-hmm. So he was down a lot of his combat power at this stage. So essentially, with the mercenaries operating in civilian attire, what you ended up was urban guerrilla warfare in Elizabethville. Staged, as we called it, fighting in a build-up area. And you didn't know who your enemy was. And they were prepared and they're ready to do it. And in addition to that, it wasn't just the paid mercenaries, including the serving Belgian military personnel, but also what you had was the white settlers. They joined in. All of those were military trained. So why were they fighting? They weren't fighting for Chomba or for Katanga. They had a style of living. Most of these would have come from the Congo post-World War II in the 40s and the 50s. They were working for the mining company. Their allegiance was to the mining company because that ensured their standard of living, their way of life. So that was the greatest motivation for them. So it was very much a different ball game when Morthor kicked off. So do you want to go back to Dick to take it from there?
Yeah. As I said, from the Irish perspective, the important operation here was at the tunnel, which was a real critical terrain in the urban environment. And C Company took the tunnel, but C Company also had another task assigned to them by the battalion, and that was to secure, to seize, hold and control the radio college. Now, we're thinking of an era when broadcasting from major stations was how you got to talk to the people. And Radio Katanga was effectively a propaganda tool for the Chombe regime. So that had been targeted. That was an Indian battalion problem. The other area was the telephone network and the communications that were in the post office, another task for the Indian battalion. But the one communication location that was given to the Irish to resolve was this place called the Radio College. It was run by the Marist orders. It was a place for training people for as radio technicians, etc. And it had a capability, and the UN identified the Radio College as someplace that it might be used by them, as it was subsequently. So that was the focus. The Irish assigned a platoon to the operation under Tom Ryan. That platoon ends up going to on the day, securing the college, break their way into it and setting themselves up. But in time, that group ends up with, I think it's 11 personnel is Tommy Ryan, and 11 personnel of his platoon is now in the Radio College, securing the Radio College. And they had gone to the Radio College. In their instruction and in the appreciation of their task, they were given to believe that they would be they'd be relieved at about 1100 hours. That was what they believed. They had no radio communications. They were told that they were so close to the tactical headquarters that was close by in Parc Albert that they could maintain contact if they needed, or make inquiries by using a runner to the runner being an army expression covering an individual who'd go physically and make contact. So C Company, very focused on the tunnel and protecting the tunnel and defending it, and the Radio College where Tommy Ryan was. You can see where the difficulty is going to arise. They have no real means of communication, no radio communication. Another element of C Company at the bridge, at the tunnel area, was there was a requirement to send out a patrol for liaison and resupply purposes from the tunnel. This was taken. This was under command of a person by the name of Sergeant George Shaughnessy, and he had 2 vehicles, and they set out at about midday from the tunnel to complete their assignment. As they passed the local football stadium, they were ambushed. And in that process, the first casualty the first killed in action casualty of the 35th Battalion was a Trooper Gaffney, who was the driver of the truck that was commanded by Sergeant Shaughnessy. Effectively, they were ambushed on the main street in front of the stadium.
And sorry, was that the first contact of Operation Morthor that Irish troops had come under? Was that the first time they'd come under fire during the operation, or?
No. A feature of the morning, once the operation took off, shortly after it took off, there was all across Elizabethville the network of support from white settlers and gendarmerie. There was they put UN positions under fire and harassing them by sniper fire, etc. That was kind of going on in dribs and drabs all over the city. So the action by George Shaughnessy, this was the first time that the UN had taken casualties. And by the way, when his patrol went out, he again had no communication with his headquarters, and they were not aware of the fact that he had been ambushed. They'd subsequently discovered about an hour or two later, when he didn't meet up with some of the people he should have met up with, that he had that his patrol was missing. It took him about 6 hours to late into the evening to make his way to different locations and UN secure locations, and eventually didn't get back to their camp until that evening. Along the way, one of his patrol was wounded in another engagement. So the Irish are starting to receive, to take casualties in Elizabethville. Sorry?
Just the first shots fired by the Irish were probably simultaneously at the post office and at Radio Katanga. And that
they're under command to the Indians.
The Indians, yeah. But they were the first Irish to be engaged, and at 0400 they opened fire, and they were the big conflicts. But
as this is happening, Jadaville comes back into the picture. From early morning, Jadaville was under attack, and it informed the battalion headquarters of its situation. And the battalion headquarters, while running the operation of the two companies in Elizabethville, started to think and plan and realise that the Jadaville situation was now part of their priority. And in a sense, the focus went off of what was happening down at the tunnel, or indeed, certainly the focus went off the radio college. The radio college only comes back into play in and around later in the afternoon, when a UN VIP who was scheduled to make a radio broadcast, and did make a radio broadcast from the facility in the radio college, he came along with a Swedish officer, a chap by the name of von Bayer. And this was the first time anybody had contacted Tommy Ryan's elements in the radio college. And at this stage, remember, they thought they'd be relieved at earlier in the morning, 1100. Now, this is well into the late afternoon. They've had no food, and they had, because of some security threats that they had expended some ammunition up to this point. And in conversation with the UN VIP, von Bayer, the Swedish officer, they asked them to give assistance. The UN VIP was very dismissive of them and said, "I'm not your messenger boys." And Tommy Ryan was particularly annoyed at that. Von Bayer went away when they had finished their job there, but later he came back and dropped some ration packs for Ryan. But in the process, he told Ryan that, Ryan, who thought he had contact nearby in the Parc Albert, didn't realise it until Von Bayer came back to him to say, the elements that were in Parc Albert early in the morning had received some incoming fire and they dispersed. So there was nobody out there that Tommy Ryan could contact. He was very definitely on his own, and this is into the late afternoon of that particular day, the 13th. And the battalion also was in a cleft stick. They knew there was somebody out there, but they had no way of getting to him because the transport and the focus was going on preparing and dispatching the Force KN1, which was the force that was to offer assistance to the people in Jadaville. Force KN is dispatched in the late afternoon, and it gets to the Lafira, and it's caught at the Lafira just as last light they tried to remove the obstacles that were on the bridge, all conducted under fire, the Irish armoured cars and APCs, and didn't manage to do so, then withdrew and set themselves to continue the operation at first light in the following day. So that's what's happening out at the Lofira.
The Lofiras are for our listeners. That will be the river separating
the river. The Lofira Bridge is over the Lofira River, about 15 kilometres from Jadeville, and maybe probably an hour and a half driving from.
About 110 kilometres from Elizabethville.
From Elizabethville. The situation at the evening of the 13th of September is that all companies have been engaged. Now we're at a night and the things go. This was in the day when there's no night vision equipment or anything of that nature, so everybody held their own overnight. Tommy Ryan, somebody was thinking about him, and the battalion log shows that the battalion sought to withdraw the patrol, but weren't allowed to do so by the higher headquarters, that they weren't allowed to withdraw Ryan's patrol. So now, and that situation is the situation at 0100 hours on the 14th. At about first light that morning, back out at the Lofira, the Force KN1 tries again to break through the obstacle of the Lofira Bridge. They attacked and whatever, but over the next few hours, despite major expenditure of ammunition and effort on their part, it was not possible to dislodge the gendarmerie or remove the obstacle on the bridge. So eventually Force KN1 was withdrawn at about mid-morning, about somewhere after 10 o'clock or thereabouts. They withdrew back to Elizabethville. It was the major effort of the battalion at that point. Meantime, back now to Elizabethville and looking at the radio college, with Ryan at the radio college. Early that morning, he's approached by a civilian and offered some food. So he offers them food, or they had no rations up to this point, and other than what the pack that they got from Von Bayer, and the civilian gave them food, and they were very thankful for it. Later, the people came back to collect the containers that they had brought the food in and collect them from them. And they were accompanied by a male. And this turned out to be a gendarmerie officer and, in this case, a French officer thought to be one of the mercenaries. And he engaged with Tommy Ryan. Tommy Ryan said he should really be arresting him, but in the discussion that they had, the mercenary said to them that they were completely surrounded, and Tommy Ryan thought to call his bluff, and but on a signal from the mercenary officer, there was a platoon plus of individuals to be seen, with all heavily armed, and against the 11 that and the level of armament that Ryan had, Ryan could see that he was surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned, and didn't have the ammunition resources to fight the situation. So the mercenary, having displayed all this equipment, then demanded that Ryan surrender. And Ryan, he gave him a very short notice to do so. Ryan had a quick discussion with his men, and he saw he was outnumbered, and he agreed, and they agreed. There were some people who said they should fight it out, but he took it on him as his responsibility to surrender. So this is the point in kind of mid-after, late morning. This is the point at which there is 11 Irish personnel, now prisoners of war, in Katangan custody, and they were moved on from there. So the battalion had no knowledge of this. Battalion's focus is still up on communication to Jadaville and to the elements at the Lofira. Later that evening, the battalion gets an inkling of what's happening, because somebody must have observed what had happened at the radio college, and a message filters through to the battalion that effectively the Irish at the radio college have been taken prisoner. And the battalion had very limited resources. Eventually it scrambled together a patrol with 4 vehicles, 1 armoured car, one what they called an APC, but was effectively a Ford armoured car without a turret, a Willys Jeep, and an armoured car, a Ford armoured car. And that was cobbled together in a patrol. And the patrol came under the command of Commandant Cahalan, who was effectively the OC of the armoured car group. And this patrol eventually got together, and at about 2100 hours left the camp to find out what was happening at the radio college. It had a particular mission, which I'll come to in a moment, but just before it left camp, it was advised by the person who had been the assistant inter officer. He advised that to be aware of the fact that the patrol had been taken prisoner. So they were heading towards the radio college with that knowledge. But their task was to recover Gaffney's body, which hadn't been recovered to this point. They were also supposed to, first to get to the radio college and find out what was happening at the radio college, recover Gaffney's body, and to check at one of the major logs bases that they had that was of concern to the 35th Battalion. And the patrol takes off. Remember, this is by night, vehicles by night in an urban environment. And when they approached the radio college, there was a silence, very ominous silence. And suddenly, the armoured car in which the patrol commander, Cahalan was the patrol commander. He was in the lead armoured car. His driver was a Sergeant Carey, and the gunner operator and the radio operator were a Corporal Nolan and a Trooper Mullins. So that's the 4 people in the armoured car. That's ambushed at the radio college. And the driver, Carey, tries to get out the back of the car. There's a side entrance, but there's also a rear entrance. He tried to get out the back of the car. He pulled Cahalan out with him. Cahalan was, they were all very much stunned by the impact of the round, and Carey pulled Cahalan out the back of the car over the prostrate bodies of Nolan and Mullins, whom they thought to be dead. There was a scramble to get into some housing nearby, and the rest of the patrol now came under fire as well. There was, as I said, a Willys Jeep, a bus, an armoured car, and the APC, all scrambling now to get into a building, which they did.
Just to clarify, sir, it must have been a large projectile that hit the armoured car to cause the personnel inside to be stunned.
Well, it penetrated. It was just an anti-armor projectile. We don't know exactly what it was, but it obviously stunned the people in the car. The two, Corporal Nolan and Trooper Mullins, were obviously knocked out to such an extent that they were considered dead by Carey as he scrambled over them, pulling Cahalan, who was totally deafened by it all, dazed and deafened by the impact on the vehicle. As they scrambled to get into a nearby house, Sergeant Carey is badly wounded in the thigh by shrapnel, and he now needed medical attention. But when they got into the house, they put a tourniquet on him, and they were now holed up in the house. So all of this action is taking place with no knowledge of this action happening, or with no knowledge of it by the battalion headquarters. This is all happening in isolation. They get into the house. They organize themselves in the house. They organize the defense of their location. Now they are aware that their ammunition is in very short supply, because the reserve ammunition in their scrambling to get in was left on the bus. So after about midnight, Cahalan decides that he looks for volunteers. For somebody to get the message back to battalion headquarters. And a Captain White and a Sergeant Dignam volunteered to do so. So somewhere after around midnight, they escape from the situation and they make their way cross country, or however, by their own means, to the battalion headquarters. They arrived at the battalion headquarters at about 0400. And this is the first time that the battalion now confirms what happened to Cahalan Patrol, and is the first time that they know that they have confirmed that the Ryan Platoon or the Ryan group is prisoners as well. In the process, the battalion was given the information that there were 2 killed in the armoured car, and that there was 2 wounded in action, Carey and Cahalan. The battalion, this is 400, at about 0500 or just coming up to first light, the battalion organised a patrol to go out and try and get an update on that position. In the process, patrol went out and came back, but and reported nothing to report. But it's obvious that they never, from later information, it's obvious they never got to the radio college. They may have gone to some other radio Katanga or otherwise, but they never got to the radio college. They reported NTR, so the battalion had the only information the battalion had was that provided by White and Dignam. But later events would tell us, no, the information that I'm talking about now was not available at that time, but it became available later when all the prisoners came back later in September. That while they were holed up, when White and Dignam had left, some people heard the armoured car start up and drive off. So kind of you have to leave that there. And that's what happened. The armoured car left, somehow or other left. So, and it drove off. Along the way, it made a wrong turning, and somewhere near a gendarme position near Chombe's house, the armoured car went off the road. When it was trying to turn, it realised it was had taken a wrong turning.
And so was this the armoured car that had been previously hit?
This is the armoured car that had been hit.
Yeah.
So, and who's driving it? One of the casualties who were in it must have driven it.
Yeah.
When they got to this location, the later events now tell you this story, or we have the information on that, which was that the armoured car drove away, took a wrong turning, ended up in an area that was close to Chombe's house. In its endeavour to turn, it got stuck in a drainage ditch, and in the process, it then came under fire and was attacked at that point. And the only two people who could have been in it were Mullins and Nolan. We don't know who's driving. But when the patrol was eventually, or when they came to looking for Mullins and found this vehicle, they discovered that there was a lot of 9mm rounds near the vehicle. So there was some firefight went on by who Mullins and Nolan, or Mullins or Nolan, at the point where the car had ditched into the drainage channel. But that's the last. Witnesses later would verify that there was an action at the car, and that the gendarmerie attacked the car and killed the people there. No further information available, other than much later it transpires that Nolan's body was found and buried, but no knowledge of Mullins. So Mullins and Nolan very quickly get posted as missing in action.
And so, sir, at this point we find ourselves in a position where the armoured car has driven off, and what subsequently transpired with the discovery of Corporal Nolan's body at a later date, and the fact that Trooper Mullins' body has never been discovered. What happens next during the operation? What's the next phase?
Well, to finish with the Cahalane Patrol, we're now into, is it the 15th? And the Cahalane Patrol are isolated in the college. A priest comes to them in the morning and tells them that, well, you're surrounded, and there is there's a heavy presence of gendarmerie.
The priest then, they get Sergeant Carey out to a hospital.
Yeah.
He's evacuated. So he is an arterial bleed, and he's lucky to be alive. He's on
he
death's
is.
door.
He comes in. He shows good faith. The priest shows good faith by getting Carey to the hospital, and but in the same time, then he comes back to tell the Cahalane what his situation is vis-a-vis how he's surrounded by the gendarmes, and he eventually brings along a gendarme officer, mercenary again, is thought to be mercenary, who comes back to tell them that he is surrounded. And from the Cahalane is left with, do I fight here or whatever? But the nature of what was available and what was and the threat that came to him, he felt once Kerry had got to safety, that they became the second lot of, they surrendered to the gendarmerie, and they went into captivity at that point. Meantime, of course, there's been, as all this is happening and the focus is, battalion has no knowledge of what's happening in the radio college. the battalion is focusing on organising the second force to go to Jadaville, now called Force KN2, and this is effectively almost the elements of B Company who are providing it's a kind of a 2-company strength operation. One from the battalion B Company and one company from the Indian battalion, and they take off to move that force. Battalion transport was very bad. They commandeered 16 buses to bring that force to Jadaville, supported by armoured cars. Is it
two Fords and two Swedish APCs?
Two Fords and assistance from the Swedes. The Swedes had a kind of an APC. So that's the resources that are going to Force KN2. To muster this group and get permission to deploy, there was all pulling and dragging rather late. They got a late start and they eventually got to about 6:30 in the morning is their deployment date out of Elizabethville up to Jadaville, and again, of course, come to the Lefira. But reading the accounts that are provided by Squadron Sergeant Desi Nolan, or Desi Keegan, he talks about this force going up to the bridge. And actually, he claims they were kind of engaged by fire before they got to the bridge area, and that the Lefira Bridge had been reinforced after the unsuccessful attempts by Force KN1. The bridge is now, the importance of the bridge is known, and they have reinforced that area now, but there's a stronger relief force, as I say, 2-company strength with armoured car support coming up to do so. And it didn't make any impression. They came to the bridge, they fought at the bridge, they endeavoured to deploy. The Indians tried to force a crossing at another railway bridge or something nearby that eventually gets destroyed by the gendarmes. So despite all their efforts, again, it becomes unsuccessful. That was bad news relayed back to the battalion headquarters, and also it was bad news for what was to happen subsequently to the company in Jadaville, Colonel Quinlan's company, or Commandant Quinlan's company in Jadaville. There is a fault in this second patrol in as much as it's still called Force KN2. Kane is in charge of it, but the A company or B company has its company commander in charge of it, and the Indian. But it was difficult to coordinate two different approaches to fighting and manoeuvre, however. They used their forces, and however they used the armoured car, it didn't change the armoured cars. It didn't change the situation. They didn't get through the bridge. Now, that position became so important. Sometime later, in 1963, there was another effort to take that bridge, and in that occasion, it was an Indian brigade supported by Irish armour and including 120mm mortars, etc., with engineers and air power. Then they got through at that place. But that's just a contrast. The full potential of a light infantry force to try and force the bridge was a non-runner, really. You want to comment on that, George?
It is, and it's worth mentioning that on the way to Lefira Bridge and at Lefira Bridge,
Yes.
the two companies, they come under attack from the air upon the Fuga. And in the attack, there was an Irish Medical Corps sergeant and 4 privates from B Company badly wounded in the attack. They were firing rockets and machine guns. And the Indian company, they suffered 3 killed and 5 wounded, actually, at Lefira Bridge. And then as the patrol, that force came to, were called back to Elizabethville. Just on the outskirts of Elizabethville, there's a place called Seven Springs. It was a nightclub. And at that location, they were ambushed. And one of the Indian trucks, a pickup truck, went off the road, and they had mortar ammunition that exploded. So their total, there was 2 killed in that, and about another dozen wounded from the Indians. So it was a very, very costly operation. And like as Dick said early on there was a great, valiant attempt to get across, but it failed. They met superior opposition on the ground and from the air as well.
Yeah.
So at this stage, there's kind of, they now know that Jarraville, to relieve Jarraville, they have been unable to relieve or support Jarraville. So they have to get into negotiation mode and the negotiation mode, and so there's a kind of a lull in the tempo of activities, but the reality is this is almost the end of Morthor. You have a company up in Jarraville, isolated, and as we know now, subsequently forced to surrender. We have already lost 2 patrols taken prisoner in Elizabethville, and an unsuccessful 2 significant operations to relieve Jarraville to be unsuccessful. So it was time for negotiation, but there was other activities. You talk about the Hammersholt thing, the loss of Hammersholt at this point.
Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General, had arrived on the 13th, the day actually Operation Morthor kicked off, and that was his 4th visit to the Congo. Now, you can imagine in the period from independence, the end of June 1960 up to September, 4 visits. Like he was a hands-on man, and he went out on the ground. And he, through the American and British diplomatic channels, he was trying to get to Chombe to have a meeting. And Chombe was having nothing, first of all, at this stage. But the fighting kind of was going nowhere. It was stalemate, really, at this stage. So Chombe agreed that he would meet with Hammarskjöld in northern Rhodesia at an airport called Ndola, just inside the border of northern Rhodesia. And on the night of the 17th, Hammarskjöld and a party of people headed off there. And in the early hours of the morning of the 18th, that plane crashed. Now, over the last 6 decades, there have been all kinds of inquiries as to how this was brought down at this stage, but there's no conclusive proof has been produced, no conclusive evidence that it wasn't actually brought down. There's been one Belgian man who had flown with the RAF during the Second World War. He claimed he shot it down, but there's nothing really conclusive at this stage. That was really a game changer. Now, the Secretary General who had come to kind of make peace in the Congo, he was dead at this stage, So the negotiations that were planned did go ahead in Ndola in northern Rhodesia. And the man that took charge on behalf of the UN was a man called Mahmoud Kiari. He was a Tunisian. He was the number 2 civilian in the hierarchy. He was the man in charge. He was the director of civilian operations in the Congo. And first of all, Chombe's approach was, okay, what I want now at this stage is I want UN out of Katanga. That's his old story. That was unachievable at this stage. Kiari played the card, I'm an African, you're an African, let's talk, and sit down and talk. So eventually there was an agreement that came in, a ceasefire came into effect as of midnight on the 20th of September. Foremost in that then led to protocols were signed again by Chombe and Kiari in October, about the middle of October, after protracted negotiations. The priority for the UN was to get the release of the prisoners, the hostages that had been taken. And there was a price to pay for that at this stage. So when that came in, the protocols provided, first of all and foremost, the exchange of prisoners of war. At that stage, the UN held about 240 gendarmerie and civic police, Catanese civic police at this stage. So there was a kind of a false dawn. The plan was there would be an exchange on the 16th of October in Elizabethville. That came to nothing. It did actually take place then on the 25th of October, and 190 UN captives were released at the old airport in Elizabethville. And the 190 included 3 civilians, 2 of them Irish, Irish workers for the UN, 1 Norwegian, 2 Swedes, and 184 Irish. There was 28 that had been captured in Elizabethville, including the Rhine Guard and the Radio College, the Catalan Patrol, and 3 other officers and 2 civilians that had tried to do a reconnaissance of the Camp Massard, which was the gendarmerie camp in Elizabethville, in around the 16th of October when there was to be the exchange. So you had 156 from the Jadaville garrison plus 28 from Elizabethville had been captured. And the price to pay that you went to pay for that is that the clock was put back to the 12th of September, the day before Operation Morthor had commenced. And the UN had to vacate all of the positions that it occupied inside in Elizabethville. It was a big price to pay, but it was worth it really. The prisoners were released and A Company rejoined. Just to quote you some figures of the total casualties that were inflicted across Katanga province. Now remember, there was a bit of fighting went up in the northeast of the province in Sector A, particularly in Minono. But the total number of UN killed at the time, you had 17 killed and 56 wounded. 3 of those were Irish. All 3, Gaffney, Nolan and Mullins, were killed in Elizabethville. You had 30 wounded. 3 of those were wounded in Kamina Base in Sector C, members of the 1st Infantry Group. You had 5 that I mentioned that were wounded at Lefira Bridge. You had 5 wounded in Jadaville. 3 of them were wounded. 2 had gunshot wounds. 1 had mortar shrapnel. 1 had, I suppose, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. They called it shell shock at the time. And the other lad was wounded. He was flying rock, bruised his shoulder, contusions of the shoulder. The other 17 were wounded in the fighting in Elizabethville. And that puts I said it was the epicenter of everything that happened. That's why Elizabethville was important. So at that stage, the protocol started to kick in, but Chamba was playing for time at this stage. He wasn't, his objective was to get the UN out of Katanga. And that fed in then to the operations that started they ramped up the problem. In December, we led the 36th incoming battalion. They faced into an actual raging war fighting in Elizabethville. I think it's important to make the point that the battalion staff had been very much stripped out because we mentioned the Katanga Command, we mentioned the Sector B headquarters. There was no staff provided for this. Sector B was manned by officers that were taken from the Swedish battalion and the Irish battalion. And from very early on there, the battalion operations officer was taken as the sector operations officer. The battalion legal officer was taken out as the sector adjutant. The signals officer was taken out as the sector signals officer. The battalion assistant IO was taken out as the IO of the sector. And even the 2ICF headquarter company, that captain was taken out for another appointment, and some NCOs were taken out. So nowadays we're very used to having joint operations centres and shift directors and watchkeepers. But the battalion was not only that, but at an earlier stage, the battalion commander had been taken into the force headquarters at Leopoldville, and he was put into an appointment dealing with refugees. So the 2IC, Hugh McNamee, was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel and made battalion commander. And the IO, who was Commandant Johnny Kane, he becomes the 2IC of the battalion, the operations officer of the battalion, and the IO.
Yeah.
So, like the ability of the battalion to function, The battalion headquarters staff to function was very, very limited, and particularly to run over a protracted period of time, over a number of days, it was very, very difficult for them.
It seems to follow a theme sort of kind of that the battalion found itself lacking in resources and lacking in personnel that it should have had on a regular basis, both at a tactical level and then at a staff level and a headquarters level, and because of what you've outlined there.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
I suppose to go on sort of into later efforts with regard to the location of Trooper Mullins' body and later efforts to try and locate that. Would you be able to outline for us how that has gone over the years?
Yeah, well, the first off was that Mullins and Nolan and Gaffney were killed, and really recovering the bodies was an afterthought. It was particularly because of the intensity of the operation that was ongoing in Elizabethville. So much so that even what I described earlier in the story about what happened at the post office and the Cahalan patrol and all that sort of thing, that wasn't clear to everybody. But when the ceasefire occurred and the units who had been detached under command to the Indians and the cavalry units detached under command to the cavalry armoured sections who were detached under command to B and C Company, they came, their attachment finished, and they came back to their base. This was the point at which Art McGuinness, who had been the 2IC of the group, was now effectively the armoured car group, acting armoured car group commander, and he started asking questions. What happened? This was the point. And even before the prisoners were returned, Art McGuinness had started a process of trying to get answers in respect of what really had happened down at the radio college. And it was new to him. So, although not quite new to him, but he was driven to find the answer. And as a consequence, he said, shortly after he came back, I think it was on the about the 21st of September, he with Captain Mark Carroll and Captain Lawless, Frank Lawless, and the Squadron Sergeant Carroll, with Captain Art McGuinness, they went out to drive the route that they thought the Cahalan patrol had followed. And lo and behold, when they got to the radio college, there on the road in front of the radio college were the destroyed three vehicles, the bus, the turretless armoured car, and the Willys Jeep. They were destroyed there. This was the point at which they knew the armoured car was missing, and I told you what had happened. They weren't to discover that again until the POWs came back. But they themselves figured they couldn't answer the question as to how the armoured car was missing. Later, as part of their investigation, again, all run by Art McGuinness, they discovered, they put out feelers and they were told where there was an APC or where there was a car abandoned. And that's the point at which they went and they discovered this down near the gendarmerie headquarters at near Chombe's residence. And no bodies were found there either. So over time, it took some time for a nun provided information about the possibility that there was a UN soldier buried somewhere, and they went to that place. They they'd found Nolan's body. It was identified as Nolan's body, but no remains were found for Mullins. And that's exactly what happened. Despite his best efforts, and it was something that Art McGuinness was very committed to. It was a lifetime's work thereafter to focus on resolving the issues around Mullins' death and the fact that he was missing in action. And when the battalion came home in December of that year, and the battalion commander and Art McGuinness made a point of going to the next of kin of all those who had been killed in of the battalion. That would be Gaffney, Mullins and Nolan. That was a hard job to do over the Christmas period of 1961. And really, that ended the Mullins story, except that there was an effort made. Mullins was a loss, missing in action, this new phenomenon, as far as the Irish Army, Irish Defence Forces were concerned. Here we were dealing with a missing in action casualty. We had two of them. We thought we had two, now down to one, distinct. And the unit in Fermoy set about remembering him, driven by the fact that more than half of the armoured car group actually were members of the 1st Motor Squadron, whose base was Fermoy. And Sergeant Carey, who had been wounded in the action at the radio college, he had retired shortly after he came home, and then there was a move afoot to erect a memorial in the Garrison Church in Fermoy to Trooper Mullins. That memorial was actually in wood and made by Sergeant Carey, who was a wood turner by trade, and that was erected in Fermoy. So, as a second lieutenant in Fermoy, and indeed captain subsequently, we were aware of Trooper Mullins, and because so many had served with him, his memory just didn't fade, and there was this monument or this memorial plaque in the Garrison Church to him, and that existed. The squadron all went on until 1998. 1998, during restructuring of the army, the 1st Cavalry Squadron was withdrawn from Fermoy and it moved to Cork. In the process, the camp became unoccupied, and the Garrison Church was given to the local parish. And unfortunately, a few years later, somewhere 2002, 2003, I think, in refurbishing the parish, in refurbishing the Garrison Church it removed the Mullins Memorial, and that set in trail a campaign to ensure that Mullins wasn't being forgotten, and that was undertaken by the ex-squadron personnel who were living in Fermoy. Mm-hmm. And they got very agitated about it and crossed swords with the Minister of Defence of the time, who made some strange statements about the missing in action casualties of the Defence Forces, an uninformed statement. And so in the controversy that was there in respect of the removal of the memorial from the garrison church, the parish priest in Kilbenny, where the Mullins came from and where the Mullins family were very respected as members of that community, he said, erect the memorial in the parish church in Kilbenny. And that happened in about 2003. But after that, there was a lot of indications that even the Defence Forces had forgotten about Mullins. And this annoyed the community of ex-squadron personnel who had served Mullins. And a campaign was initiated by those ex-members of the squadron in Fermoy and a local journalist. And a campaign was initiated to have the state do something about Mullins. Up to this point, Mullins' name is on the plaque at the foot of the grave in Glasnevin, but there are those. But he's not in the grave. Mm-hmm. He's the missing in action casualty. And out of this process and a very sustained campaign, the state eventually conceded something. The Defence Forces organised a board under what was then Colonel Pakenham at the time, and he was assisted by Commandant Richardson and Commandant Lang of the archives, and they were forced to review the whole process of what had happened Mullins and to bring to a conclusion, a definitive conclusion, as best they could, where his remains were and how his remains were disposed of. And they produced a very satisfactory report, which was delivered in person to the family by the board president, Colonel Pakenham. I think he was then the GOC in the south. And as a consequence of that, and as a recommendation of that board, the state erected its first memorial to a missing in action casualty of the Defence Forces in Kilbenny with the approval of the parish priest in Kilbenny. It was erected in the grounds of the church, and that has become an annual place of pilgrimage by a number of people, usually the veterans, now in declining numbers. And that system, or that monument to Mullins that was erected in the churchyard there, became the model for remembering the other casualty, Private Joyce, who was lost as a member of the unit in Lebanon, and in his place on the Aran Islands.
Well, sirs, thank you to Colonel Kerton and Colonel Heaslip for a fascinating account of the events surrounding Elizabethville. We really appreciate your time and for you coming onto the show. Thanks very much.
Very welcome.
You're welcome.
This special episode of the Irish Defence Forces podcast constitutes my final outing as host as I prepare to deploy overseas on United Nations service. My position as host will be filled going forward by Captain Rishtard Byrne of the Defence Forces Press Office, and I'd like to wish Rishtard all the very best in upcoming episodes and seasons into the future. For further information on the Irish Defence Forces, check out our social media channels and military.ie. Serving members are also encouraged to check out the members area of military.ie. The Irish Defence Forces podcast is available on Spotify, Acast, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today's episode was produced by Corporal Keith Harrison and Sergeant Paul Keeley of the Defence Forces Audiovisual School. The Irish Defence Forces podcast will be back soon with new episodes. Until then, thanks very much for listening and stay safe.